and I don't necessarily think this is new, but I think it's sort of realive or whatever, is from experiences to people want transformation in some way, like personal transformation in some way. I don't know if you know Eric Davis. He wrote a book called Technosis in like the 90s that's got a lot of play, but he's a sort of esoteric researcher and anthropologist, I would say, about a lot of like subcultures.
Yep.
A lot of psychedelic subcultures, but also some other things. He helps curate a space in Berkeley called the Alembic, which is one place where you're getting a lot of interesting overlap between the people that are thinking about AI. And you're getting a sort of overlap of a lot of different ways to approach consciousness, whether that's sort of like through religious or Buddhist or spiritual traditions, or like thinking about it through machine learning and modeling and sort of like AGI folks. It's the human potential movement is kind of coming back around.
Welcome back to the MO Podcast, where we chat with innovators whose big ambitious projects are shaping our creative and cultural world. I am your host, Joey Flores, here as always with my co-host, Jonathan Neal. Today, we have a special guest whose work sits at the fascinating intersection of art, technology, and cultural development. Barry Through is a creative technologist, curator, and cultural producer who has spent years championing new ways of thinking about how art and technology can serve our communities. Prior to his current work, Barry honed his skills collaborating with organizations like Obscura Digital, where he led software innovation for large-scale interactive and immersive experiences. Since then, Barry's continued to forge a path connecting artists, technologists, and audiences through imaginative projects around the globe at Gray Area Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco. As the driving force behind Gray Area, Barry has helped transform this nonprofit into a major hub for creativity and social impact. Gray Area supports workshops and residencies for emerging artists, hosts festivals exploring immersive media and data-driven art, and fosters a community built on collaboration across disciplines. Barry's vision emphasizes the power of technology to bring people together and addresses real-world challenges, something we'll dig into in today's conversation. So without further ado, let's welcome Barry Through to the MO Podcast. Barry, thanks for being here.
Hello. Yeah, delighted to be here. Couldn't have said it all better myself. Thanks for the warm intro.
We try to do well with the intros.
Yeah, right on.
So Barry, through our work with Inversion Art, we've become relatively acquainted with Gray Area and your innovative approach to merging technology and culture. But we often like to start the pod by asking our guests, what was the most ambitious project or venture you undertook before your work at Gray Area?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. So there's a couple of things. There's a lot of the work that we did at Obscura Digital, which if people don't know that company, we were a San Francisco-based company that was the first company to do architectural projection mapping. So like all of the projection you see on buildings and things, we had a lot of the early patents around that work. And we started out with domes, projecting on the inside of geodesic domes. And the sort of origin story of that company was like sort of having a bunch of like people that were into experiential and electronic art that started projecting on the inside of these domes, and it turned into this whole company. That existed until it got acquired by Madison Square Gardens to do the work on the Las Vegas Sphere. So we did all the early concept work and some of the design and I would say media pipeline work for spherical content for the Las Vegas Sphere. Anyway, there were projects at that company that were sort of giant, like 80 projector, large architectural projections. There was a large one at the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi that was for the 40th anniversary of the United Arab Emirates. But we also projected on the Empire State Building, on St. Peter's Basilica. I helped start a company with a gentleman, Keith McMillan, who just died couple months ago, unfortunately, very young, who was a real visionary in electronic music instrument design. He helped start the first MIDI-capable violin company. It was a company called Zeta in the 80s, but was a genius at particularly at analog electronics. But we had a foundation called Beam Foundation. There was an ensemble called Trio Metric, which was a guitar, violin, and upright bass trio and all of the instruments were augmented with sensors, and all of that sensor data was fed into this central computer system, which gathered that data and it allowed you to process it and kind of map it and set it to controllers and things. There was a notation system to this thing that controlled a composition. And so what you could do, and it was sort of an ambitious and deep and kind of like large, very esoteric. And it was like, there's a user interface problem there because it was so big. But it is still the only instance I know of a comprehensive way for improvised electronic music that can be saved in compositions that can be replayed and could potentially be taken and like given to another ensemble. And so we thought about this like replayability and performance in electronic art, because and this is true of both visual art, but we were squarely in music and like generative visuals space, but it's such a performative medium. And the big question is like, why are Bach compositions classic? And one of the big reasons that that's true is that there's this replayability and reperformability and reinterpretation that can happen of the media. It's interesting to think of like how that may be changing in software and digital art now. And so I would say that project, there still hasn't been anything like it. And we put a lot of development time on it. And it turned into a company called Keith McMillan Instruments, where we made weird commercial products like we did a Bluetooth violin bow that had like 11 axes of sensing on it. And it's interesting, that was around 2006 or 2007.
I have a question about the Las Vegas Dome and just this dome art in general. It's interesting to me to hear you talk about projection. I would have assumed that the dome was made up of 1,000 LED.
It's LEDs. It is LEDs. Oh. Yeah, maybe I didn't fill in the rest of the story. We started out doing projections and we projected on a lot of things, but the real thing for the sphere was the content creation pipeline of being able to capture and generate content that was both extremely high resolution and that would look sort of perspective correct for an audience. And so there's the whole media creation pipeline aspect of that whether you just have a canvas of light somehow or another. So whether that's projection or lasers or LEDs.
Well, it's clear to me just by this first few minutes of our conversation why an organization like Gray Area wanted you.
Gray Area, we haven't even got to that yet.
Why don't, for our audience who isn't familiar with Gray Area, I've got a 3-part question, which is what is Gray Area and was it mission when you joined? How did you joining come about, and how has the mission evolved since you became involved?
Yeah, sure. So there were a lot of people in a community that came together around Gray Area at the beginning, but the founding ED and sort of like organizer is Josette Milchor, who ran the organization as ED for 10 years. I met Josette at a dinner that was a fundraising dinner, and this would have been probably 2007, I think. But there was a group of people trying to build a digital art museum in Berkeley, California, like for electronic and digital art. And they were trying to raise $150 million to build this digitally native museum. And the person that was sort of spearheading that effort was Jane Metcalf, who was one of the founders of Wired magazine. But anyway, all of the sort of like digital art people at the time were gathered around, and I was working and still do work with another organization called Recombinant Media Labs. The whole interest of that organization is we do surround cinema, like spatial composition for surround audiovisual compositions, sort of more from a cinematic lens than like what a lot of the immersive stuff is now. Anyway, we all met at this dinner. And from that point started working together. The organizations started working together, and then sort of over time merged. We lost the space. Initially, one of the insights was that there were all of these artists doing generative visual, software-based art, generative visuals, and to some degree like data-driven generative art. in San Francisco at the time, which, like I said, was like 2008-ish. But there was no organization focused on that sort of technology-based visual artwork. I think one model for that. So originally it was focused more as kind of like a gallery, and that where we were going to do presentation and have artist studio space of this sort of generative artwork. And it's interesting how that genre of art, nobody saw the NFTs coming or any of the sort of like interest in generative art that has happened in the last few years. So long time ago. There's one, I think one sort of like reference point for what was being thought about at the time was this gallery Bitforms in New York, which has been doing digital art for a long time. And so like you can think of it, so, okay, what would a Bitforms look like in San Francisco? Can we do something like that? We discovered very quickly that I would say the difference in our interest from that is that Gray Area has always had one part of its DNA is sort of this performance art element also. So like music, DJing, immersive, that sort of thing. And so that sort of sets us apart from something like Bitforms a little bit. We have very little to do with the contemporary art world per se, in terms of sales or engagement or visibility or anything. And so like that, it's interesting because we're sort of apart from that whole thread a little bit.
Is that by design, or is that just sort of a fact of the kinds of communities that you attract and the projects that you're working on?
I think both. So this has changed a little bit over time. Maybe let me finish this thread and then I'll get back to that question. But I do want to talk about that question. So I'll try and speed through this. So originally it was more of a gallery model. We did a few shows and then we all learned that we didn't really, and there's no strategy to this really, but we didn't really want to be in the gallery business. Like that business just what you have to do to be successful in that business didn't appeal to anybody of us in our 20s at the time, just like doing this arts organization. Nor do I think it would have been particularly successful because San Francisco still has the art market's challenging here. So it turned into sort of project and education and sort of meetup community gathering space very quickly. During the next 5 years, we moved into 4 other spaces. We were a little itinerant for a while. And during that time, we focused on a lot of civic development, hackathons, and projects in public space. In particularly, there was a project called Urban Prototyping that we helped develop, and that had some legs on it and started being copied in many cities around the world. But it was basically about, it's adjacent to the maker movement that was happening at the time and sort of like personal DIY fabrication and construction. But how can people that live in the city start to have some agency and purchase over the sort of the development and design of a city? And so we had a bunch of teams that created physical prototypes of various sorts of installations. There were some like composting toilets, that sort of thing in public space. Also some more art project type of things, but they all had this aesthetic design element to it, and they were put out in the city for people to engage with. There was some data visualization kind of stuff of like, how can you get a city to kind of look at the larger scale data and environmental trends around it and understand the aggregate a little better. So we did a lot of that public space stuff. And then 11 years ago now, we moved into our current location, which is historically the Grand Theater, which is on Mission Street in San Francisco between 22nd and 23rd. And so we moved into there, renovated it, turned it back into sort of an original cultural usage. And actually the city of San Francisco last year designated it an official historic landmark. So we have some protection of it. And so over time, the mission has kind of evolved, the educational elements, the sort of like knowledge building elements, and also like what both in the context of San Francisco and I would say with its relationship to what technology has done, which is like hard to argue that technology is not the driving force of cultural conversations now. I'm sure there's some counter arguments to that here and there, but I've seen it and believe it, at least when you're talking about most art practices. And so, what I say now to get to the triumphant conclusion of this thread is that I think we're really thinking about how do you support and sustain a counterculture. And that's not necessarily to say that it's like opposed to anything, but I think there is a sort of hegemony of what's driven by the technology conversation that requires a different set of perspectives and like ways of working or modus operandi, one might say, towards how we relate to understand technology and the way it structures and conditions our society. And we're sort of unique in that we do this through this sort of integrated set of programs. And so we have the sort of public presentations side of it, which is exhibitions and performances and conferences and symposia and things like that, but also have the education programs to teach people both technology skills through the production of creative work and to have some like agency for how to use these tools, but also how to align and engage their practices with real world issues. So there's some like media theory and just like other sorts of sciences, arts, humanities, this sort of interdisciplinary approach of how to collaborate and build collective knowledge as a part of the programs. And then we have some research and like incubator programs. So we have some ways to support projects that can scale up and be deployed, and also are doing some like different sorts of research around things like experiential art or like simulated AI models or expanded cinema or distributed like data trusts, things like that. And so in some ways we're really trying to work across these sort of modes of acting or domains by doing projects both socially and in practice, have some new ways of like engaging with the world. And so in that sense, and like not ignoring politics and not ignoring, all the different sorts of the social writ large. And so I think that's part of the countercultural aspect as well, which builds upon, in San Francisco and the Bay Area particularly, it's like, I think it's worth asking the question, what does a technically literate 21st century counterculture look like? Is it possible? What does it look like if it is? Like, what does it mean to people? And like, because San Francisco has kind of abdicated its role in nurturing that sort of thing, which was a big reason, I think, a big reason why the economics, and it's why this technology thing happened there, because of a creative milieu that happened. So
you have Fred Turner as like as an advisory board member, and I think, some people that listen to the podcast will know, but Turner wrote this amazing kind of art and social history from counterculture to cyberculture, and that really demonstrated the kind of rise of the DIY tinkerer culture of the West Coast, sort of created the kind of ethos or the libertarian DIY sensibility of Silicon Valley to begin with. I remember looking at that, like beginning with Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog, and thinking about that as the kind of a beginning of this kind of an intersection of this kind of synthesis that you're talking about, right? It's like everything from agricultural activity to energy production to information distribution to community building and politics, et cetera, all sort of encapsulated in one place. I'm curious, what are the projects that stick in your mind that Gray Area has produced or has hosted or has facilitated that you think come closest to that kind of synthesis, or the ones that maybe it's more of a personal preference for you, but what are the technologists, the artists, or the projects that you've been involved with recently that you think are sort of pushing in those directions in interesting ways?
For sure. So we do a lot of different sorts of things, and so I have a lot of different answers for this. But one example of a project we did several years ago was called the Experiential Space Research Lab. And the way that this project sort of manifest this was right when like immersive Van Gogh was happening.
Yeah.
And so there was all this conversation, everybody's like, oh, is this an opportunity? Is it a crisis? Particularly in like the museum space. museum attendance is down. We want younger audiences, but we're slow and stubborn. And so we can't figure out whether we should do this or not, if it'll like undermine our cultural cachet or what,
Right.
But I think it did. So we got a grant from the Knight Foundation to do a research project around this, which consisted of, we did a field scan of just like what was going on, but we also put together a project where we a group of friends who now run a studio called Spherical, and they do a lot of environmental design work, I would say, and research. Right now, they're working a lot on the watershed in the LA area and how sort of like hydrological cycles affect the whole ecosystem, including things like what's happening now down there. We put together this project where we got a group of interdisciplinary, I'll say the word artists, but I say it broadly because everybody was making an art project, but these were not all artists by vocation. We had some environmental researchers and architects and different folks that were a part of this project. And we went through a sort of 6-month conceptual dive into Gaia theory, which is, it's been sort of like aesthetically processed to where you can think really kind of hokey things about Gaia and whatever. But the original insights from James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis were about how the flows of different sorts of processes and resources on a planet help homeostatically maintain its environment. So that's true of Earth. And like the genesis of this was they were thinking about it, is there life on Mars? And NASA was going to like chuck a probe up there and like look around and say, we'll find out. And what James Lovelock said at the time was, well, I can tell you, all I got to do is look at it, because if on like the heat, the heat signature, the data that you can get from a planet just from the, telescopic image, I can tell you whether it has the kind of atmospheric cycle that would support life or not. And you don't even have to go up there to look. You can just, and so and then they turned this back around on the Earth and started thinking about, okay, how does the planet maintain its own boundaries? So we got all these artists together and we went into all of that. There are a whole lot of concepts around what they call second order cybernetics, which are like what they call autopoietic systems. It's like organisms or things that have kind of coherence and integrity and agency in themselves. And these artists created together, self-generated an exhibition and projects called, they came to the project with I came to the lab with some project ideas, but then we threw them all out and like had everybody reconstitute stuff. And the exhibition ended up being called The End of You, by which they meant the beginning of us. And the idea was, okay, how do we get through this vehicle of immersive art? How can we get people to start thinking about other people and then other species and then a whole living planet? And it was kind of like an anti-selfie museum in some way, because the whole thing was like expanding consciousness and sort of reducing ego to get this collective kind of sensibility of what it meant to be on a connected planet. And there were a lot of different exhibitions. So like I think that's one example where we like use this immersive art form, but also had this sort of like conceptual payload to it and did it in a way where we had a group, a very cross-disciplinary group that many of whom had never exhibited anything or created an exhibition before, generate something that was really greater than the sum of its parts. There's one example from like the immersive art side. But I think in a lot of our research projects and things, like we're doing a lot of work based upon the legacy of Gene Youngblood now, who wrote a book called Expanded Cinema. And there's several we're also doing a lot with Andrew McLuhan, who's the grandson of Marshall. We did a whole conference and have a class actually that's running right now. He does a whole multi-part series on Marshall's book, Understanding Media, and goes chapter by chapter and talks about how it relates to what's going on now. And I think you can still join that class for audits if anybody's, depending on when this reaches people's ears. Yeah.
I like, as you're saying this, I'm like looking right above my right above my computer monitor, and I've got Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media staring me in the face.
Yeah, there you go. So Andrew's really carrying the legacy of all of that thought forward, and doing a great job contextualizing it to the current day and helping to understand issues that may seem confusing towards this really like prescient and still, largely that powerful sort of like media theory that Marshall was doing. So you had a question before that we skipped, but it was interesting. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, I was curious about the relationship to what let's call the conventional or legacy art world, right?
Totally.
And the way that exists not just for gray area, but for, I think, San Francisco more generally. I think, since I've been involved in the art world, there's various different kind of cliches of the conventional marketplace that, talks about how there's plenty of money and plenty of very smart people in the Bay Area, few of whom are sort of interested in art in the same way that people in New York and Los Angeles and some other cities around the country, like Chicago as well, seem to be interested in art. There's this question of art and technology always seemingly, and we know historically and sociologically completely connected and sort of mutually reinforcing along the lines, but always seeming to make strange bedfellows whenever someone puts art and technology in the header of an organization or a conference or a book or whatever it might be. It never seems to come together in the right way. And so you have artists who, work with technology in very rigorous ways, who seem to have high visibility within the conventional art world. I'll just mention someone like Pierre Huyghe, who had this in the most recent Venice Biennial that got a lot of praise and a lot of coverage, but is sort of very involved in robotics, artificial intelligence, but also narrative and a bunch of other interesting scenarios. And so I would point to that as like a demonstration of at least one artist among many who gained recognition within the conventional or legacy art world, but somehow, like you just wouldn't, it's just not the person that gets mentioned when you talk about sort of art and technology, spaces, discourse, communities, and what have you. So I'm curious, as someone who's sitting firmly at the boundaries of that within the precincts of San Francisco and the intersection of these various different worlds, how have you seen it evolve? What are your thoughts on that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a sort of San Francisco centric sort of train of thought on that, and then kind of a larger one. I mean, it's interesting because media arts were always this kind of third space thing. Big community focus on it the whole time. A lot of it was supported by universities and academia, and then it kind of came out. In Europe, it has some more sort of like public infrastructure, like things like Ars Electronica and more like institutions and things. In the US, it's interesting because there were, of course, there are these historical antecedents like drawing from the Bauhaus to EAT, the sort of experiments in art and tech, all of this sort of stuff. So there was a little bit more knowledge at one point that like this kind of like relationship, I don't know, the United States. So there's this post-war period of pretty interesting kind of like thought going on that we seem to have lost a little bit now.
Well, it's kind of that moment of synthesis, right? I mean, there was less siloing maybe from the standpoint of what artists were engaged in and how they were interacting with one another. So that maybe to use a more esoteric term, there was more deterritorialization in from the 50s into the 60s and the post-war period, or even coming out of the immediate World War II period, that then seemed to have gone through this large sort of serious siloization. And so maybe a more simplistic way to put it is like, the art and technology crowd seems to get ghettoized the same way that like street art gets ghettoized. It gets shunted off as a kind of as an area of interest that has its communities and has its interests, but always seems to be somehow just to the side of whatever the sort of major museums and funders and programs seem to be interested in. Although, again, that said, you just had the big Pacific Standard Time, Getty, art and
Well,
technology,
that's the
exhibition.
science thing. Yeah.
But
So
interestingly, I kind of feel like, not sorry to preempt this, but I kind of feel like that was, I think people looked at that as successful. It was very big, but it had its sort of brief moment of attention, and then it just it hasn't existed in the public consciousness in the same way, right? It's like it's not, it doesn't seem like it's going to have this impact the same way the previous two iterations of that big multi-part aggregate show would have. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, maybe I didn't. I mean, of course, I'm aware of it. Know a lot of. I haven't been down to see anything yet, and like now it's. I don't even know. But
it's those shows are sort of in their waning days.
Anyway, this week isn't the week for it.
Nope, definitely not.
So yeah, media arts has always been in this sort of like separate space for a long time, and this is even in relationship to the contemporary art world, and most other institutions. I would say one of the reasons gray area exists is because it is a necessity for it to, in the sense that like a lot of the other larger institutions just don't support this work that we support, doesn't find easy support in other play. There's no, it's sort of like astonishingly so, right? The fact that something like SF MoMA doesn't have some sort of like technology program is like, I mean, as much as I love being literally the only game in town, and largely in California, and one of a handful in the United States, we can count on one hand the sort of organizations focused on this sort of intersection still, right?
Right.
Wild that doesn't, it's just like mind blowing to me in San Francisco that like somebody hasn't put $100 million into some sort of program that does something along these lines.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway,
which is a good pitch to funders. You're like, come on.
Well, we've been pitching it for 17 years. Whatever.
I mean, it seems like if there's a place for any civic-minded and semi.
Of course, it actually engages with the city. Yeah, it's like it seems like such a home run that it's like crazy how much we still don't have wind at our back from it, because all of the indicators continue to point in this direction. Anyway, I mean, in terms of the contemporary art world, it's like even when you talked about video and like porta packs and stuff, they like that was rejected. Like any of this technology or media that's performative or that kind of stuff they didn't understand. And it's funny because so for the first years, of course, we were like, because we started out more from this performance art tradition than like a sales, like we're selling art sort of thing. I think that sort of placed us in a certain track in terms of our relationship to that world. But it's interesting because I would say since 2018, and it's interesting because we did a lot. Gray Area did I guess a couple more things I could reference. We did the first exhibition of generative AI artwork with Google in 2016 with the Google Deep Dream stuff, and brought a group of artists together, gave them early access to technology, and like they created work. And then we also did in 2018 we do a yearly festival called Gray Area Festival, which this will be its 11th year this year in September, I think is when the dates will be. We haven't announced quite yet. But 2018 festival was blockchain's NFT. I mean, it was a little NFT was kind of it wasn't the NFT time yet, but we had works with Bitcoin and like some very early.
Yeah, those were definitely blockchain years. I remember 2017, 2018 was the kind of first moment with really hearing about that within the art and cultural space.
And nobody cared. Like we did this exhibition in 2018, nobody cared. It was like. I mean, I remember having some arguments because I wanted to put blockchain in the title, and there were people that were like, nobody knows what that is. Like literally, it was like the people, nobody will come, they don't know.
And they still don't know what it is, right? Like, I mean, it's still.
Well, it's a distributed ledger, don't you know?
Yeah, exactly. You can put Sam Bankman-Fried in the title, and they'll know what that is.
Exactly. So I think the high level point here is that, and those were years where I was going to Basel, Miami, pretty, for whatever reason, I was going there more than I have been. And the interesting thing was that blockchain, and we can talk, there are various reasons we could unpack for this that we could have a whole other podcast on or whatever. But blockchain, I mean, the big one's just like free money or whatever. But and AI, the interesting thing that happened is that when you look at even like the press releases for art, they started to adopt the sort of technology startup language in their press release. You know, so it was like these ideas of innovative and particularly first, this is the first this and this is the first that. But you didn't in mid-century, whatever, you went to art galleries and stuff. That's not the way they talked about what art was doing.
Right.
And now it's like, if you don't have that like early release moment, even things that aren't like NFTs or whatever. I mean, I'm talking about like writ large, this like process of technology has changed how people are thinking about cultural production. And it's also true of, you know, particularly in the media art space, things like that happen at Pacific Standard Time. And now, so like, I don't know if everybody's caught this yet, but like the UN declared this like the year of quantum, right? This is the year of quantum science. They just said it, you know, and so, or voted on it, or like, I don't know how they do that.
Right.
What you'll see, because, and this is the thing, gray area is at the middle of this, and we're not like necessarily, it's like hard to say resistant, but like, it's like you want to not be driven by, you know, you want to, in some sense, you want to know if you're the tail or the dog in this stuff, right? And so it's like, you'll see there's this group of media artists, and their sort of MO of survival now is to be first early adopters of whatever technology paradigm is coming down the pipe.
Right.
And so what you're going to see in this next year is all of a sudden a bunch of arts institutions are going to be like, quantum is the metaphor of our time, you know, because like this whole science can be, because the money follows it because of the technology. And then culture is the funding and resources and everything for, and this is because in the US, there's no cultural money. It's like the entire NEA budget for the nation is like $220 million or something like that. It's like nothing. And so there's no public money. The corporate money is largely either siloed internally. It's not like the corporate money is like going out to just, you know, sometimes you'll get artists that'll get commissions and things, and we do a lot of that, which is helpful, but it's not like they're directly supporting independent public infrastructure. For even if you go to traditional institutions like the symphony or the ballet or something, flip to the back of the program, that's not where you see Google, Meta, like Oracle, IBM, like any of that. Sometimes you'll see like Hewlett Packard or something, but you know, it's like the newer companies just don't culturally operate that way. And so it's like the way that this is shaken out now is that all of these artists have to, as fast as possible, absorb whatever the new technology paradigm is, whether it's quantum or whether it's technologies like VR, AR, whether it's the new science, you know, biotech. It's like wherever that wave of like attention goes, that's what you see people doing. It's the cycle of that, like writing that's, you know, AI, clearly. It's like, okay, well, it's AI. And why is that? It's because, I mean, it's interesting in its own terms, but it's also because that's where the financial support and resources are. It's like, you don't have that ability to like take a step back and like take the time of like how you're going to engage with something. You have to like latch on, right? So it's like, that's a challenging sort of notion. And so I think one of the things, like, you know, talk about our mission again, if we can somehow create some sort of breathing room around that stuff to like have less pressure, I think that's, you know, not to engage, or not that it's bad to do, you know, we're of course interested in work that engages with all this stuff, but that isn't driven by whatever the imperatives are of those things necessarily.
Sure.
Barry, you mentioned this sort of 2017 project, but, you know, people didn't know what blockchain was and stuff like that. When you have an organization that is, constantly sort of at the forefront of new technology, it sort of reminds me of like, startups where somebody starts a streaming company like back in 98 when people are still using dial-up modems and really, couldn't download streaming content fast enough for it to be an enjoyable experience. So sometimes there's just like great technology and great companies that are just too early. And so it sort of sounds like that may have been, like not necessarily the case that you were too early with this exhibition or this project, but that because you are constantly at the forefront, you may be putting out things that are, from an interest standpoint, from the community and from the broader ecosystem is early, right? And people don't know about
that.
Yeah,
for sure. Does
that happen to you guys a lot? Where you feel
like
that 5 years ago?
It happens to us a lot, and I think we're so early a lot of times that we're like, let's say with this AI stuff, it's like it's so long ago that nobody even remembers that we did. Like there's very, at the risk of being like, organizationally aggrandizing or something because whatever, but like we did do the first show of generative AI art. Like you can there'll be art historians that are like, oh no, actually it started in 1945, but that's not what I'm talking about. In this current trend, like this with these generative neural networks, we did that. We're not in the footnotes of it really. And like, so whatever, I mean, it's not, I
think Joey's real question is why isn't gray area just like why aren't you just like Bitcoin billionaires at this point?
Well, maybe there's that. I mean, I think that like one of the natures of like having that sort of not that distance and that for this nonprofit, we have sort of that like critical distance. And I think maybe, some of this is also true. Like I've spent a whole career like running for money basically, so like I don't know how much that filters down into the org at this point.
I feel like the org is in a good position just to be like, listen, we take just a little bit of the operating capital, get a couple of our board members to put forward just a little bit of fund, and like we'll just stick a little bit of this here and there, and it might not be worth something in the future, but if you'd been sitting on a few Bitcoin back in 2014.
It's
a whole new endowment,
And I'll tell you, I was, I can say this, I was involved at Gray Area at that time, but not. I wasn't, I've been running it for the last 5 years.
It only half.
I was, but like, this is true of me too. It's like, I was at Obscura Digital at the time. And I remember looking at Bitcoin and like some of the other like coins that were my Ethereum also, and saying like, okay, I got this because we were doing all this graphics work for these experiential things. And I was like, all right, all these computers are dead at night. Should I just put miners on all of them and start doing this? I have the equipment and like I can just run this program. And then, whatever, you just keep working, you just don't do it. And then it's like, okay, like the amount of missed opportunities of like almost, like being aware of something, knowing that it's going to be a thing, and then just like,
it's very hard.
I used to say this because I got to San Francisco in 4, which was like between it was like after the first .com. And it was like, and it was an interesting time there because I think there's usually nothing better for arts and culture than a good crash every once in a while, because then it like levels out, you get cheap space, you get all that kind of stuff. So like refocuses everybody's sort of like priorities. But I always used to say like, man, I wish I was here during .com 1, because then I could have made this money and then I could have just paid for this stuff that we have to scramble for money for. Like, and like now at this point, I've been through enough of these cycles that I know what I would have done, which is like, watch it go by from the banks of the river or whatever. But no, I mean, look, but organizationally, the answer to that is like, we're focused on like understanding and like trying to think about how to collectively build a better society for everybody. We're not, to our detriment in some ways, we're not sitting around focused on like, it's in some way non-interesting to focus on some of these money-making things in the way that you would have to build a corporate enterprise. And there's lots of, I think we've had some things that we've tried to do that and have been like near misses or whatever, so like there's some of that that's just historically contingent of like, but we're generally supporting, and I'm not saying it's not strategic in a sense. I think it's just a function of sort of like what everybody's interest, where the priorities of like how we think of what we're up to is like, we're not taking equity in very much. Right. And like, it's still a nonprofit. And I think there's good things about that, but like this is we could do another whole hour on this, but like, I've definitely thought about now, like, okay, do we need a for-profit entity, attached that we could do certain things with, that would engage with these topics in a certain way, that may also think about financial sustainability in a different way. And so I think we do definitely operate under this sort of more traditional nonprofit model of like grants and funded labs and things that doesn't operate in a traditional lots of business opportunities that pass us by. And I think part of it's capacity, and part of it's like, it's just what you're focused on, and like part of it's bootstrapping is a part of it too. It's like, maybe if we had some money in the bank to invest in a business proposition that would wind up being like net positive for everybody. Yeah, maybe.
Sure.
But like we're also like like, I don't know.
This is a little bit just more sort of sheer operational, but so gray area has pretty significant program service revenue, as I understand it. I did in my research. Anytime I'm doing research on nonprofits, I'm always digging into the 990s just to like really get a picture of what's going on. But I think that unlike a lot of nonprofits, right, like the program service revenue for gray area is fairly substantial, right? I mean, which is not what you see from a lot of nonprofit arts organizations, which are sort of almost, at least 80 to 90% grant funded, donor funded, really rely on the kind of year to year largesse of a board of trustees that's out there sort of, giving and getting the funds that the organization needs. Whereas I was interested to see just briefly, like what is the from program service standpoint, not just venue rentals, obviously, but like what are the things that you're doing that are sort of creating a little bit of this flywheel for the organization?
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple of things, and I'll say, just to contextualize it a little bit, this has all changed quite a bit since 2020, where prior to 2020, the theater operations and education programs and sort of labs and things, we were about 85% revenue from the operation of the theater and like incubator dues and all that. And COVID kind of just like screwed, like the changes since COVID have kind of like screwed all that up. So like ticket sales are still down. There's also the other thing of like San Francisco people don't really donate in the same way. I mean, that's of course not categorically true, but I would say as a function of the size of our audience and the kind of jobs and income that they have, you would expect, there's something culturally going on there, that's true.
I can tell you very specifically what that difference is with regard to New York, but I'm not going to interrupt.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing to talk about because it does affect a lot of the San Francisco cultural landscape. We've sort of done service things over the years, and a lot of the times it's working with companies to facilitate various sorts of art programs within the companies. In the past, we did it a lot with Autodesk, which has changed. Right now, we do a lot of business with Google. We do a lot of business, and what those jobs or like what those services look like is sort of like curatorial and production services and commissioning for project management that goes either inside corporate campuses or inside like that kind of thing. So we kind of consult and produce projects that go inside in relation with companies. And some of these are bigger projects, some are smaller, but we've been fairly lucky in that, as opposed to what you were saying earlier about like, why haven't we bought a Bitcoin or whatever? We have done some of this sort of like service kind of stuff. And so that part almost operates as a somewhat autonomous business line that is sometimes cross-pollinates with the rest of the sort of programming and things, but not always. Sometimes it's just like trucking along doing its own, own kind of like focus or whatever.
But it's smart. I mean, it's, because it's I think that just stepping back when we talk about this from a kind of business analytics, nonprofit organizations across the art and cultural sector have gotten very used to a kind of mix of their revenue that has just become so highly dependent on, for lack of a better way of describing it, a kind of discrete social network that is invested in a specific organization and ends up being attached to, the egos and the life cycle of particular people. And that if you stand back, on the one hand, if the organization itself becomes big enough or the brand becomes connected enough to a locale, then it can survive those board in a way. But if it's not, then, the board is the thing that really drives the organization. Unless, of course, there's another way of raising money and earning revenue. And so, for the people that are listening, I applaud, Gray Area's capacity to do this, because it's just, you're also engaged in the kind of real economy in a way too, that a lot of nonprofits have a tendency not to be.
Yeah, we tend to be agile in that way. And I would say, I think probably our biggest, one thing is we have to be agile in that way to survive. I would say, at the moment, none of those sorts of business lines like that last forever. And so it's always on my mind, there is
who's the next client? Who you're going to work with?
Well, it's who's the next client is one thing, but it's also diversification.
Right.
So it's like, okay, I would say, you looked at the 990, it's like, we're a little heavy towards that stuff right now. And we need to figure out some way to diversify that. So it doesn't take the whole thing off the rails. If something, something can always, one person can be like, we're not going to do this anymore. And then we have no, so
financial crisis and all of a sudden everybody pulls back and there's no budget for anything.
Anything can happen. So I think, I do think that the one thing that we may have, I think on the blockchain NFT stuff was something that we probably could have engaged with and done a lot better on. It's hard to figure out during the time where that stuff was really heated up. It was very difficult to figure out how to engage in such a way that felt like it was authentic or something.
Totally.
With the sort of speculation and volatility in that market, and that distance from it was not anything necessarily to do with the, we don't like NFTs because of what, anything like that. We were actually very engaged with it. It was more.
We get it. Joey and I were raising funds for Inversion Art through that frothy moment, and I can't tell you the number of conversations we had with people that were just like, man, if you make this an NFT business, I'll give you X amount of money right away. And
totally,
just it just left such a horrible taste in our mouths, and it was just completely orthogonal to what the mission of the company was and what the artists were interested in, and it just didn't jive. Right, there was no prospect there that made sense of hitching the NFT, badge to whatever else it is you were doing just to kind of make do. Authenticity, be damned.
So there's always this stuff of how do you maintain your autonomy and kind of coherence, in terms of vision and mission. And and also the other big thing, like you alluded to earlier, is how, what is the communication with the public? Because we, like we said before, we're early on a lot of this, we've been early on a lot of this stuff, and dealing with some of these early issues, you are by design going to have a certain sort of slightly technical or esoteric way of communicating these things, because they're early and they're but then there's sort of there's a big section of the mass audience that's we don't get it, so we're not going to show up, so there's a certain amount of alienation that happens because of that too. And so how do you communicate things to a mass audience that's not that both talks about the sort of nuance and specificity required to discuss how these things are, function or fit in to the social fabric, but also not having people be I just want to beat, it's got a beat and I can dance to it, or what, it's that tension. I like that tension, but man, it's a challenging one to navigate with all these things coming along,
Yeah. I think that parallel, I think, is actually goes to the earlier question about the kind of relationship to the conventional contemporary art world, because as I've been sort of thinking about it over the past few months, I think that contemporary art on the whole is just dominated by like an expanded idea of just being decorative, right? Like if like the museums, the collector base, like everything is just like it's like people are interested in a kind of a decoration of their museums, their walls, their properties, whatever it is, and this is what drives the purchase of sculpture, painting, photography, basically just like static things. There's nothing wrong with that, but as soon as you sort of think about like everything that you're doing within the world of sort of conventional or legacy art activity is basically just a kind of a decorative project. That's that one category. And then there's the stuff that is like inherently non-decorative, which is a lot of kind of performance, moving image, anything that's kind of dynamic or time-based is a little bit more difficult to sort of operate within that legacy decorative world. And then it's like, and you can talk about it, it's like, oh, this is more experiential based or durational or however you want to describe it. But it's basically, there's ways of addressing that set of conditions more or less interestingly. And like you said, it may be more esoteric or it may just have like a good beat and you can dance to it, but it's like that's the, between the decorative and the entertaining, there's this, not to hazard this, become too cliched, but it's like there's this big gray area, which is this.
Well, I mean, there's the big punchline, right?
Yeah,
but it's like,
exactly.
I do think we talked a little bit about this experiential space research lab. I think one of the interesting things about that, and this sort of thread still hasn't seen its end, which is like, or it's whatever its culmination is going to be. But at the time we were thinking about, okay, there's this shift from objects to environments. Mm-hmm. Right. It's like okay, you don't want a group of objects in a room. You want this more environmental presentation of like, and it's multi-sensory. If you're in AI terms, you can almost say multimodal. I think we're more like multi-sensory. And then I think so you're in experiences, and it seems like, and I don't necessarily think this is new, but I think it's sort of realive or whatever, is from experiences to people want transformation in some way, like personal transformation in some way. And I think this is coming up particularly, and there's a space that's getting a lot of attention now that I don't know if you know Eric Davis. He wrote a book called Technosis in like the 90s that's got a lot of play, but he's a sort of esoteric researcher and anthropologist, I would say, about a lot of like subcultures. Yep. A lot of psychedelic subcultures, but also some other things. He helps curate a space in Berkeley called the Alembic, which is one place where you're getting a lot of interesting overlap between the people that are thinking about AI and sort of different ways. You're getting a sort of overlap of a lot of different ways to approach consciousness, whether that's sort of like through religious or Buddhist or spiritual traditions, or like thinking about it through machine learning and modeling and sort of like AGI folks, or thinking about it through different sorts of like, it's the human potential movement is kind of coming back around from like the thread that like Esalen started, right? And so all of that stuff in California right now is moshing together. And I think that when it comes to art, I don't think this is like it's going to take over the whole cultural field or whatever, but I do think there's a strong thread right now of people not just wanting experiences, but they want to somehow be more explicitly transformed through engaging in the experience, whether that's an expansion of consciousness or it's like a new set of social relationships or a new understanding. That one always assumed that was kind of a byproduct of art, but I think it's sort of a more explicit desire in the construction of these things now. So we'll see if that winds out. It's true in some way already, but we'll see if it gains any steam or not.
Religious conversion. Yeah.
Well, we're definitely in a. It's like we're in a. Kind of like Empire Strikes Back kind of like thing here. So yeah,
that's super interesting. I'll check it out. That's Alembic, ALEMBIC, the Alembic.
I think so. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's like a lot of the time it's a yoga studio, but then they do this like programming and stuff there. It's got a very interesting mix
Yeah.
Of you should at least check it out and like kind of see what's happening there, because I think there'll be more things like it.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, you talk about political realignment, there's also some cultural, you're getting some like in some ways obvious, but in other ways previously disconnected kind of like bedfellows in these in what's shifting now. So I think, it's yeah.
Barry, do you have time for our more opinion segment? We've got 3 questions unrelated to gray area.
Okay, I do. I have 12 minutes. So that's what I got.
Perfect. Okay. First question in the more opinion segment is, if somebody gave you a budget or a funding of $10 million to build your own project or venture unrelated to gray area, what would Barry do with $10 million? What kind of project would you love to embark upon?
Immediately to Mexico. You'd never hear from me again.
You don't need $10 million to come down to Mexico.
No, well, but I would have 10 million. That's the thing. Turns out you don't need $10 million. Great question. I think that, the interesting curveball is like unrelated to gray area, because it's kind of like my whole, it's like it's a sort of just vehicle for a lot of things in that I'm sort of interested in still constructing these social spaces or whatever. I think, a lot of people have gone in the sort of retreat model now, but I do think that there's room for a certain type of organization that gets sort of out of the conference mindset and back into like how you see this a lot. It's funny. There's a lot of these, and I truly don't, I have a lot to say about the politics around all this stuff, but what you see that like I have various disagreements with, but it's like this network state stuff that's going on where you have these sort of like, I don't particularly care for things that are like enclaves or like separated from society, but I do think that there's some room for places for people to gather and have deep sort of conversations that aren't in the same sort of conference model and things. So I can see various sorts of centers and things to start that are really sort of like thought leadership and think tank sorts of things. I'm really interested. That's one answer. That's probably not my $10 million answer though. It's something I'm interested in, how that changes. I'm interested in, I think if I were to do some sort of technology thing again, it would be in the simulation space. And I think particularly in environmental simulation, I think we're at the point now where we have enough open data sets and environmental data and cheap enough commodity like game engines and things that we can build a new set of tools for understanding sort of environmental modeling and simulation. And there's of course, an AI component in there as well to kind of make more and better tools for policymakers and narratives for environmental decision, coordination and decision making about environmental management. I think that's a thing that is really needed. I have other answers too, but I sort of caught on my back foot with that one. It's like, yeah.
You're not the first person to tell us that's the question that might require more than 30 seconds of thinking to respond to. But but that's an interesting one. I think the question is, do you need, would you just use 2 million to build the tech and then 8 million to line the pockets of politicians to pay attention to it?
No, I think it's I think it's people really need. Honestly, I think it's like you would be surprised at the policy and decision making level how little in terms of modeling and visualization in the sort of government it exists. There's the tools for this stuff just they're not intuitive, and they don't give you, anyway, the adoption has not caught up with the advances of technology in that case. Like applying a lot of this stuff that's happened in virtual and simulated worlds, video games, all this stuff to like actual real world engaged to not entertainment is like, that hasn't really happened,
Sure. Second question, also unrelated and unaffiliated with gray area. What is a person or project that you see happening in the art and cultural sector that you admire or are excited by, that you think, that you would like to draw some attention to?
Yeah, there are a lot of, not related to gray area. Let's see where you draw that line. I think the group at Serpentine in the UK is doing a lot of interesting stuff. They have an arts technologies group, and they currently have this exhibition called by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst called The Call. And there's a lot of interesting things about their work, but I think in this particular case, one of the things that I can think of very few other examples of this where they have the show itself, which talks about sort of embodiment in the voice and AI. They have AI modeled. They created a model of fed from data from samples from a bunch of choral groups around the UK that they use to make this model, and then you can interact with the model. And there's other parts of the exhibition, but the point I'm making with this is they have a technology component to it, which is this idea of data trusts. So how do you create data sets that you can model on that have different sorts of ownership and licensing relationships to the groups that created the data? And so there's like that technology component to it. And there's also a policy component with this group Radical Exchange. They are talking about this concept of a trusted data intermediary, which is like a policy prescription, different type of entity that would sort of steward and take care of the licensing rights for a group of beneficiaries of data sets and different sorts of like monetary or licensing sources. And so you have this exhibition that has a technology component and a policy component that are both like real things to potentially deploy in the world. And I think that group of things together is like the way that arts organizations can more directly engage themselves with like affecting what's going on in the world by thinking about all of these different sorts of artifacts and effects and systems that are like wrapped up into the work itself. And so I think that's a very sort of like forward looking expression of the way this art and technology overlap can have more real world engagement than just being sort of like a conceptual thought exercise, you know. So I got there's one thing.
We'll have to check it out. Maybe they're a good candidate for the show.
They'd be a great candidate for that. They would be a fantastic group to talk to.
Cool. Nice. All right, last question, the more opinion segment, and arguably probably one of the funner questions. If you could steal any work of art or cultural artifact to enjoy for yourself, but really never tell anybody because, of course, it has been stolen, anything from the Statue of David to, anything more obscure, what piece of art or cultural artifact would you love to take for yourself and have?
Interesting. There's a, I don't know, like, again, if I thought about this more, maybe I'd have better answers or different answers. But there's a work I've always loved by an artist, Jeffrey Shaw. And it's interesting because you can't really steal it. The funny thing about this is it doesn't really, it's an augmented reality piece called The Golden Calf, very early, probably the first augmented reality work. And what it was is there was a screen, there was sort of this screen set up faced at like an empty white pedestal. You could carry this screen around like an iPad, but this was in the 90s. This might have been 92, 93 or something. What you saw in the augmented reality was this like model of this golden calf on this pedestal. And I thought it was always such a clear, like, it was such an early and clear piece that like, I've always loved that work. I don't know if it's really, okay, what's the thing I would steal? It's like, man, it's an interesting question. It's like, I'm trying to think of like a building or something. So then I would have this building, it's like, I would steal the Burj Khalifa because that's the, I don't know.
That's very smart.
Yeah. I don't know.
But then where would you hide it? You can't share it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the real thing is where would you hide it? It's like, yeah.
That's right. So like there have been a couple of these answers have turned out into these like Despicable Me type of answers, right? Like you like steal the moon.
The moon? I was gonna say, does the moon, can I have the moon? Like, is that a cultural artifact? I guess.
It's really a cultural artifact, exactly.
Yeah.
I like the Jeffrey Shaw piece. I just looked it up. Interestingly, it's like certain things are tough to. Maybe this goes to the sort of anti-decorative gray area.
Yeah,
ethos. Like you've got it's a world that assumes a kind of property regime that certain kinds of practices and certain kinds of work don't apply to, which is totally fine.
It's like, can I affect history with my answer to that question?
Exactly.
If I like stole the bullet that killed Franz Ferdinand before the, can we change the course of what might have been? Like, I don't, anyway.
Right. Before it was a cultural artifact.
That's right. Steal Stewie Griffin's time machine from Family Guy and go back. And,
exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And just like watch, just be like completely ineffectual. Yeah. Totally.
Perfect.
All right. Barry, thank you for coming on the MO podcast.
Thanks so much. It was fun.
Yeah, super interesting. Be out in a week.
Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it again. Thank you for coming on.
Right on. Bye-bye.